By 1965, the US military is betting its strategy in Vietnam on the helicopter. The Bell UH-1 Iroquois, or Huey, is supposed to give American forces the mobility to find and destroy enemy formations across jungles and swamps where roads barely exist. Backed by gunships, jets, and artillery, US planners expect air mobility to offset the Viet Cong's advantages in terrain and local knowledge. Instead, the helicopter proves to be both the war's defining asset and one of its greatest liabilities, and the men sitting in its open doors with nothing but a machine gun and a harness will pay a disproportionate price. The concept behind air mobility had been developing inside the US Army since the late 1950s. In 1962, the House Board concluded that helicopters could fundamentally change how ground forces moved and fought, freeing infantry from terrain that had constrained armies for centuries. Instead of fighting for control of roads and ridgelines, an air-mobile force could bypass enemy positions entirely, inserting troops behind or around defenses and forcing the enemy to fight on American terms. In a country like South Vietnam, where dense jungle, flooded rice paddies, and limited road networks made conventional movement painfully slow, the appeal was obvious. Still, the concept remained untested in combat. To prove it, the Army activated the 11th Air Assault Division at Fort Benning in 1963 as a test formation. For 2 years, the division refined helicopter tactics through exercises at Fort Stewart and across the southeastern United States. By June 1965, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara approved a permanent air-mobile division. The test unit's colors were retired and its personnel, equipment, and doctrine were folded into the 1st Cavalry Division Air Mobile, commanded by Major General Harry Kinnard. The division arrived in South Vietnam in autumn 1965 with over 400 organic aircraft, most of them Hueys, and set up its base camp at An Khe in the Central Highlands. Within weeks, at the Ia Drang Valley, the 1st Cavalry would see its first major engagement. The results appeared to confirm the theory. The division's air assault troops inflicted heavy casualties on North Vietnamese regulars entering from Cambodia, and the 1st Cavalry claimed a 10-to-1 kill ratio. This, though, would prove harder to replicate than the early numbers suggested. The battle also revealed a fundamental problem. The helicopter itself was vulnerable, and the enemy had already begun to figure out how to exploit that. The vulnerability of the helicopter is the reason the door gunner existed. A troop carrying Huey, what crews called a slick because it lacked external weapons pods, could carry 6 to 8 infantrymen depending on conditions. It approached a landing zone at low speed, flared to a near hover, held position while troops jumped out, and then climbed away. During that approach and departure, the aircraft was at its most exposed. At low altitude and low airspeed, concentrated small arms fire could bring a Huey down. A single round through a hydraulic line, a fuel cell, or a tail-rotor drive shaft could turn a flyable machine into a falling one. The NVA and Viet Cong understood this very quickly. American after-action reports from the earliest helicopter operations in 1962, when Army CH-21 Shawnees flew South Vietnamese troops into combat, noted that the enemy adapted to helicopter tactics within months. They positioned automatic weapons along likely flight paths and concentrated fire during the moments of approach and departure. It is a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the war. The Army's initial response was armed escort helicopters, UH-1Bs fitted with machine guns, rocket pods, or both. These gunships would suppress enemy positions before and during a troop insertion. But gunships could only cover so much ground, and a landing zone might receive fire from directions the escorts could not immediately address. The slicks needed their own suppressive capability, something that could put fire on threats that appeared close in, off-axis, or during the seconds when the aircraft was committed to the landing and could not maneuver. The door gunner filled that gap. It was not a role the Army had planned for in any doctrinal sense before the war. It was a role the war created. In the earliest helicopter units, the arrangement was informal. Crew chiefs, the enlisted soldiers responsible for maintaining a specific aircraft, began carrying personal weapons aboard and firing from the cabin during hot insertions. Some units armed crew chiefs with M1 carbines or M14 rifles. The inadequacy of this was apparent almost immediately. A rifle fired from a vibrating helicopter at a target obscured by rotor wash and vegetation was at best a gesture. What was needed was a belt-fed weapon with sustained firepower, mounted to allow the gunner to engage targets across a wide arc. The M60 machine gun became the standard solution. A 7.62 mm weapon capable of firing around 550 rounds per minute, the M60 was mounted on a pintle in the cabin doorway, giving the gunner a roughly 180-degree field of fire from front to rear on his side of the aircraft. On a standard Huey slick, there were two door guns, one on each side. The crew chief manned the left gun. A dedicated door gunner manned the right. The two roles were distinct. The crew chief was the helicopter's mechanic, personally accountable for its maintenance, and he flew every mission his aircraft flew. The Army's logic was straightforward. If the crew chief maintained the machine, the crew chief had the strongest incentive to maintain it well. The door gunner, by contrast, was primarily a weapons operator. He rotated among aircraft more frequently, assisted the crew chief with maintenance on the ground, helped load and unload troops and supplies, and manned the right side M60 in flight. Both men sat on the cabin floor or on canvas seats with their legs sometimes dangling in the slipstream, tethered to the aircraft by a monkey strap to prevent them from falling out during aggressive maneuvering. The body armor issued to them a ceramic chest plate, nicknamed the chicken plate, weighed about 25 pounds. Many gunners chose to sit on their armor rather than wear it, reasoning that fire from below was the more immediate threat. It was a practical calculation based on where the rounds were most likely to come from. Training for the role varied considerably over the course of the war. Early door gunners learned their trade almost entirely in country, shown the basics by the crew chief they were paired with, and expected to develop proficiency through repetition. As one former crew chief with the 240th Assault Helicopter Company recalled of his arrival at Fort Rucker, Alabama for helicopter maintenance school, "What do I know about helicopters? Zero. So they taught us." As the war expanded and helicopter units proliferated, the Army formalized training at Fort Rucker, where soldiers attended maintenance school followed by separate instruction in door gunnery. The military occupational specialty code was 67N20, though in practice the classification system struggled to keep pace with what the job actually involved. On any given day, a door gunner might perform pre-flight maintenance, prepare ammunition, fly 3 or 4 combat assaults into different landing zones, run resupply to units in the field, fly medical evacuations, and handle whatever emergency tasking the company operations officer assigned before dark. The weapons arrangement evolved as crews learned what worked. Early M60 mounts were rigid pintle systems that limited the gun's range of motion. As the war continued, many units switched to bungee cord suspensions, elastic cords attached to the cabin ceiling that supported the weight of the gun while allowing the gunner to swing it through a much wider arc. The trade-off was precision for flexibility, but at the ranges door gunners typically engaged, 50 to 300 meters, the ability to traverse quickly mattered more than fine accuracy. Gunners loaded their own ammunition belts with a standard 4-to-1 ratio of ball to tracer rounds. Experienced crews often added extra tracers to improve their ability to walk fire onto targets. The official ammunition load was around 1,000 rounds per gun. In practice, most crews carried double that, absorbing the weight penalty. As one Huey crew chief with the 9th Aviation Battalion recalled, "Our crews would be damned before they were outgunned or out of ammunition, so we normally carried twice the official allotment of ammo and didn't worry about the extra weight." The M60D, a variant designed specifically for aircraft use, replaced the standard buttstock and pistol grip with spade grips and an aircraft ring sight. One advantage airborne M60 gunners had over infantry was the cooling effect of the slipstream. On the ground, the M60's barrel overheated quickly during sustained fire, requiring frequent barrel changes and limiting the weapon to short, controlled bursts. In the air, the wind passing over the barrel at 60 to 100 knots provided continuous cooling, which meant door gunners could fire far longer bursts without the same risk of a runaway gun or a cooked-off round. The same crew chief noted, "In the air, we depended on the volume of our fire more than anything else, so I fired much longer bursts from the Huey than I ever did on the ground." This mattered, because the door gunner's primary contribution was volume of fire. His job was to put enough rounds into an area to suppress enemy positions during the critical seconds of approach and departure. Accuracy was secondary to density. In a typical combat assault, a package of 8 to 10 slicks carrying an infantry company flew in formation, escorted by 2 or 3 gunships and monitored by a command and control helicopter overhead. If intelligence suggested the LZ might be defended, the gunships would make preliminary firing runs, and artillery or tactical air support might prepare the area beforehand. The slicks would then descend in formation, flare into the LZ, hold for the few seconds it took troops to dismount, and depart. Door gunners would begin firing as the aircraft entered the approach, suppressing tree lines and visible positions on their side, and continue through the departure until the helicopter climbed above the effective range of small arms. The problem was that intelligence about whether a landing zone was hot or cold was frequently wrong. American forces in Vietnam operated with imperfect knowledge of enemy dispositions more often than not. An LZ that appeared clear on aerial reconnaissance could contain a dug-in company that held its fire until the first wave of helicopters was committed and vulnerable. When that happened, the door gunners were among the first to know. The sound of rounds hitting aluminium is distinctive and does not require interpretation. In a hot LZ, the door gunner's task shifted from suppression to survival. He fired at muzzle flashes, at movement, at anything that might be shooting at his aircraft, while the pilot tried to get the troops out and the helicopter away as fast as possible. The entire engagement might last 15 to 30 seconds. In those seconds, the door gunner's fire was often the only thing preventing a concentration of enemy weapons from focusing on the cockpit. Casualty figures for door gunners specifically are difficult to isolate from broader aircrew statistics, but the available numbers tell a clear story. Of the roughly 2,700 people killed while serving aboard Huey helicopters during the war, over 1,100 were crew members, a category that includes both crew chiefs and door gunners. Another 2,165 helicopter pilots were killed across all aircraft types. Combined with passengers, helicopter operations accounted for more than 10% of all American combat and combat support deaths in the war. The popular legend that a door gunner's life expectancy was 5 minutes was an exaggeration, but it reflected a genuine perception among the men who did the job. Still, the figures do not tell the whole story. The geographic and operational diversity of the door gunners' war is often underappreciated. In the Mekong Delta, 4th Corps, Huey crews operated over flat, open terrain where the primary threats were automatic weapons concealed in tree lines along canals and dikes. The lack of elevation meant approaches were visible for miles, giving enemy gunners long windows to track incoming aircraft. In the Central Highlands and border regions of 2nd Corps, the terrain was the opposite. Steep, jungle-covered mountains where landing zones were carved from triple canopy forest by engineers or created by bombs, and where surrounding vegetation could conceal entire battalions within a few hundred meters of the LZ perimeter. In the northern provinces' 1st Corps, proximity to the DMZ and the Laotian border meant helicopter crews routinely encountered heavier anti-aircraft weapons, including 12.7 mm heavy machine guns and, later in the war, 37 mm positions that could engage aircraft at altitudes well beyond the effective range of an M60. Each environment demanded different techniques and different calculations. The one constant was exposure. The tempo of operations imposed its own kind of attrition. A door gunner in an assault helicopter company might fly 200 to 300 combat hours in a 12-month tour. Some flew considerably more. During peak operational periods, the 1968 Tet Offensive being the most extreme example, helicopter crews in some units flew from first light until dark for weeks without a meaningful stand-down. The physical demands were considerable. Airframe vibration, noise levels that left many veterans with permanent hearing loss, the weight of body armor and ammunition, and the sustained alertness required to scan for threats during every moment of flight. Fatigue became its own category of risk. A tired door gunner was a slow door gunner, and at the speed these engagements unfolded, slow could be fatal. Helicopter operations in Vietnam were not occasional events. They were the connective tissue of the entire American strategy. Without helicopters, resupply to remote fire bases would have been impossible. Medical evacuation, which reduced the mortality rate for wounded soldiers to under 1% within the first 24 hours, depended entirely on helicopter availability. Troop movement across terrain that would have taken days on foot could be accomplished in minutes. Army UA-1s logged over 10 million flight hours in Vietnam between 1966 and 1975. Each of those hours carried a crew chief and, on most missions, a door gunner. And so, helicopter crews did not experience combat as a series of discrete engagements with recovery time in between. They experienced it as an ongoing condition. A slick crew might fly 5 or 6 combat assaults in a single day, interspersed with resupply and medevac flights, returning to base only when maintenance requirements or darkness grounded them. The relationship between the crew chief and the door gunner was a defining feature of the job. The crew chief was typically the more experienced of the two, responsible for the aircraft and, by extension, for teaching the new gunner how to stay alive. Experienced crew chiefs could feel a change in rotor harmonics that indicated a mechanical problem, hear the difference between a round striking the airframe and a piece of debris kicked up by the rotor wash, and judge from engine pitch whether the aircraft could sustain the load it was carrying. The door gunner learned these things by proximity, or not at all. There was no formal mentorship program. There was a crew chief who had survived long enough to know what mattered, and a new arrival who had not. The individual replacement system compounded this. Unlike the Marines, who often deployed units together, the Army rotated soldiers individually on 12-month tours. A door gunner arrived in country alone, was assigned to a company, and joined a crew that might already be 8 or 9 months into its collective tour. The new man was the least experienced person on the aircraft, occupying the most exposed position at the moment when the crew's institutional knowledge was at its peak, but its patience for teaching was often worn thin. By the time the door gunner had accumulated enough flight hours to develop genuine competence, he might be approaching the end of his own tour. The crew's experience level was therefore always uneven, always cycling. The emotional and psychological dimensions of the role are also worth noting. Unlike infantrymen who operated within a platoon and company structure that provided at least a framework of mutual support, door gunners were often relatively isolated within their units. They flew with the same crew chief and pilots on most missions, forming tight bonds with those 3 or 4 individuals, but their relationship to the broader unit was mediated by the aircraft. They saw the war from 100 feet rather than from ground level, which meant they witnessed events at a scale infantrymen rarely experienced. They watched landing zones erupt. They saw the aftermath of ambushes as their aircraft came in for medevac pickups. This perspective came with its own costs. The role also carried particular moral weight. A door gunner's rules of engagement were, in theory, governed by the same restrictions that applied to all American forces. In practice, the speed and chaos of helicopter operations created situations where the line between suppressive fire and indiscriminate fire was difficult to locate. Firing into a tree line during a hot insertion was doctrinally sound. Determining whether movement at the edge of a village represented a military threat or a civilian population was a judgment call made in fractions of a second from a moving platform. The war produced documented incidents where helicopter crew members intervened to prevent atrocities, most notably Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson and his crew during the My Lai massacre in March 1968. Thompson's crew chief, Specialist 4 Glenn Andreotta, and door gunner, Specialist 4 Lawrence Colburn, trained their weapons on American soldiers to protect Vietnamese civilians. That incident illustrated both the moral complexity of the position and the degree of autonomous judgment that door gunners were sometimes required to exercise. As the war progressed and the Army's helicopter fleet expanded, the door gunners' tactical environment shifted. The introduction of the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter from 1967 onward gradually replaced the UH-1B and C model gunships in the escort role, providing dedicated attack capability with greater speed, firepower, and survivability than the improvised Huey gunships. This was a doctrinal acknowledgement that the armed utility helicopter was an inadequate substitute for a purpose-built attack platform. For door gunners on the slicks, the Cobra's arrival meant better escort protection during combat assaults, but it did not eliminate the need for door guns. The close-in, reactive fire that only the door gunner could provide, the ability to engage a threat that appeared on the aircraft's flank during the final seconds of an approach remained a capability no external escort could replicate. The NVA and Viet Cong adapted continuously to American helicopter tactics, and each adaptation made the door gunner's job harder. Anti-aircraft weapons became more prevalent and more sophisticated as the war continued. Early in the conflict, most helicopter losses resulted from small arms and light machine gun fire. By the late 1960s, 12.7 mm heavy machine guns were common along helicopter routes in the border regions and northern provinces, and man-portable anti-aircraft weapons began appearing in NVA inventories. Against a dug-in 12.7 mm position, a door gunner's M60 fire was largely a gesture of defiance rather than a tactical response. The practical effect was that helicopter tactics evolved to minimize exposure. Faster approaches, steeper descents, shorter ground times at landing zones. Each of these adjustments demanded more from the door gunner in less time. The war also produced variations on the role that departed from the standard slick configuration. On some Huey gunships, particularly the UH-1C models that served before the Cobra's widespread deployment, 2 additional M60s were mounted inside the troop compartment on bungee cords, operated by a crew chief and gunner who cradled the weapons in their laps and fired out the sides while the pilot triggered externally mounted miniguns and rockets. These gunship door gunners operated in a fundamentally different context from their counterparts on the slicks. They were flying into contact deliberately, providing fire support or suppressing landing zones ahead of an insertion. Their exposure was, if anything, greater, because the gunship's mission required it to orbit the engagement area and make repeated firing passes. On medevac helicopters called dust-off ships, door gunners faced a different situation entirely. A medevac aircraft was supposed to be unarmed under the Geneva Conventions, and early in the war some flew without door guns. That policy eroded quickly as medevac crews took fire with increasing regularity, and by the mid-1960s most dust-off aircraft carried M60s. The door gunner on a medevac flight was protecting an aircraft that could not choose to avoid a hot area because the wounded on the ground could not wait for the situation to improve. The minigun, a 6-barreled electrically driven weapon designated the M134 and capable of firing up to 4,000 rounds per minute, appeared on some helicopter configurations as the war progressed. Mounted on a flexible door mount, the minigun gave certain aircraft a dramatic increase in suppressive firepower. But the minigun was heavy, required electrical power from the aircraft systems, and consumed ammunition at a rate that limited its practical use to short engagements. It was not universally available. For most door gunners through most of the war, the M60 remained the primary weapon. Across the war, approximately 5,600 helicopters were destroyed, roughly half the total fleet that served in the theater. Of those, around 3,300 were Hueys. The Army needed door gunners badly enough to put them in the most exposed position on the most heavily used aircraft in the most helicopter-dependent war in history. And yet the role had no formal recognition proportional to its risks. There was no special insignia, no dedicated award category, no post-war memorial specifically honoring the men who sat in open helicopter doors with a machine gun across their laps. The crew chief, at least, had the professional identity of an aircraft maintainer. The door gunner was, in the Army's classification system, something closer to an afterthought, a position that existed because operational reality demanded it, staffed by men whose training was improvised, whose equipment was adapted from other purposes, and whose contribution was measured in the survival of aircraft and crews, rather than in any metric the Army was inclined to record. Over 2,700 crew members were killed aboard Hueys alone. The actual number of door gunners among that figure is not cleanly separable from crew chiefs, a statistical ambiguity that is in its own way a fitting summary. The helicopter made the American way of war in Vietnam possible. The door gunner made the helicopter survivable. The Army built an entire strategy around the first, and never quite got around to formally accounting for the second.